So we're going to officially get started. And so first of all, I would like to thank you all for joining us this morning, joining us in the importance of keeping our diverse workforce healthy. Such an important topic as we deal with the global pandemic of COVID-19. Certainly, we want to have this discussion as it relates to Oregon and Southwest Washington. These are the areas that we all know and love, and we want to make sure that we have a discussion that is a community discussion around this important topic, and we want to make sure that it is comfortable and that is relevant and connected and correlated to the neighborhoods and the communities and the places of work that are so important to us here in the Pacific Northwest. So the conversation is important in that regard, and we're so thankful that each of you felt so as well, and you decided to join us. So for that, we're very thankful. I want to say thank you to the Portland Trailblazers for partnering with us on this endeavor. It's great to have great friends and great partnerships, and the Trailblazers have certainly been that. They have supported this initiative since the beginning. So thank you to the Trailblazers as well. And so what we'll be doing today is we'll be covering several questions and a variety of topics, all designed to equip our leaders and our workforce and professionals in this area to be more healthy and to have much more success as a community. So we will focus in on that. As we cover these particular areas, we're going to talk about equity. We're going to talk about inequities that exist as a result of COVID-19 and how they've been highlighted as a result, so to speak. And really, equity as we define it is providing an opportunity for everyone to receive what they need to be successful. So that is the lens that we will be looking through, and certainly we will hear our expert panelists discuss that as well. We will talk about the impact of COVID-19, both on our mental health and our physical health, and what that means for our employers and what that means for us as individuals in our communities, and how we can address those things so that we can have a more substantive solution to how we move forward. Towards the end, I would encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A. We will reserve some time at the end of this discussion to make sure that all of you have an opportunity to have your questions answered, and we'll do our very best, our absolute very best, to get to as many questions as possible. So I encourage you, if you do have those questions as you're hearing these compelling conversations, that you would enter those conversations into the question and answer area. So now for the exciting part, I get an opportunity to introduce to you two, I would say, friends of the area and also friends of mine. And it is an honor for me to have such wonderful and distinguished friends that I've had an opportunity to have dialogue with. And it was so compelling to speak with these two individuals that I wanted to make sure that we had an opportunity to bring this conversation to each of you so that you could hear the enlightened words that they have and the wisdom that they have in their respective areas, so that they could help move Oregon forward, so they could help move us all together, and that we could all be a healthier community together. So I'm excited to share their backgrounds with you. So I'm going to give an introduction. We're going to honor ladies first, and I'm going to introduce Dr. Debbie, and Dr. Debbie will then take the floor, and she will describe a little bit of her background and experience with each of you. So I'm going to start with a brief introduction of Dr. Debbie. Dr. Debra Jenkins is a PhD. She is the CEO and founder of Share the Flame, LLC. It's an executive coaching and leadership consulting firm here in the Pacific Northwest. She is also an award-winning life coach and author and presenter and facilitator. And I know this personally, she is an educator with expertise in social development and liberation. And when I say that she is an outstanding educator, Dr. Debbie is an outstanding leader and educator. And those that know her, love her, and know her work very well. She is phenomenal in how she communicates complex ideas and the issues that affect us all and affect our community. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce to you affectionately known as Dr. Debbie. And Debbie, if you wouldn't mind sharing with us a little bit about yourself, your background, your connections to the Pacific Northwest.
Thank you, first of all, for that. I was like, that's pretty big. That makes me look awesome. So anyway, I was actually born in Portland, Oregon, and grew up in Portland, Oregon. I was one of the first Head Starters over at King's School when it first started, and went to Humboldt. And then we moved over to the Irvington area, right? And I grew up in what's now called historic Irvington. My mother is still there. And went to James Monroe High School. And after that, went to Portland State for a minute. The spirit was willing, but my wallet was weak, so I had to quit. But my educational journey found me. My educational journey came after opportunities came to me. So people would say to me, we'll hire you if you promise to. And I was like, sure. So then I would go to school to catch up with where I was. So I have an associate's in early childhood education, and I have a BA in human development with a focus on developmental education. I have an MA in human development with a focus on bicultural education. I have a MS in psychology, and then I have a doctorate in higher education administration. So I have been teaching for since 1992, and then became the first African-American female to be tenured at Clark College. And then I was the first to receive the Outstanding Alumni Award. So I have a lot of the first African-American woman to receive that award. So I've had a lot of firsts, but that doesn't mean it was stress-free. So I hope I can share some of those experiences along with some theory and practices to support the non-negotiated environments that a lot of people experience in their work.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Dr. Debbie. And if I can ask you just one follow-up question before we get to Dr.
Sure.
Stephen. What has been the catalyst? What has been the primary driver for you in the pursuit of the work in the area that you've chosen? Was there a moment in time, or is it a culmination of instances and experiences that has led you to this work?
I've always been someone who has been interested in equity, even as a child. I was the one that got in fights to defend people who other people picked on. So I was always the one who needed to stand up for the one who didn't have a voice. And as I got older and understood voice better, I realized I didn't need to speak for anyone, that you just help people and support them in their voice and they can use it themselves. So I had a passion. People came to me and asked me to come and train them and come and support their staff and their faculty. And it grew, actually. So what started off as a hobby became Share the Flame, LLC. And I really love what I do, because that's exactly what happens. I give, people take that and they go share it with other people. That flame that they gain in our connections, they can take and share with other people. So I don't see this as a Debbie thing. I see it as a community thing, because I see it impacting the lives of people.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you for that. Absolutely amazing. And I went to Humboldt as well. So I am honored. I was a Humboldt student and remember that very, very well, those days of walking to school in that community. So I did not know we had that tie.
Yeah. Did you have Martha Jordan?
That name sounds familiar.
She was the first it was so interesting. She was the first African-American woman to teach in Portland Public Schools.
Wow.
And she was my kindergarten teacher.
Then that is very likely that she was mine as well then.
Yeah, yeah.
Wow, amazing, amazing. Well, that's wonderful. Thank you. We're honored to have you.
Thank you.
Now for Dr. Stephen Noble, MD. Dr. Stephen is a board certified cardiothoracic surgeon. He is decorated in the United States, was decorated in the United States and is a United States Navy veteran. He served 7 years on active duty as a general surgeon and cardiothoracic surgeon. He is passionate about his mentorship for youth and youth advocacy. He's an entrepreneur. We're going to talk about his entrepreneurship here in just a few minutes, which I think will be very advantageous for communities and communities of color. Health education, civil rights, and social action. Dr. Stephen, we are honored. Welcome. Please tell us more about you and your connections to Portland and the Pacific Northwest, if you will.
Appreciate it. Good morning, Orlando. Good morning, Dr. Jenkins. I'd like to thank you for the opportunity inviting me here, as well as the Portland Trailblazers, my favorite team, for sponsoring this event. My grandmother, who has now passed, was a big Portland Trailblazer fan. Her favorite player was Brian Grant, and so it's an honor to be a part of this community conversation. My connection to Portland, I grew up in Portland. My grandparents moved to Portland in the 40s, part of the second Great Migration from Blacks out of the South to the Pacific Northwest. So they represented Louisiana, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Illinois. And my parents grew up in Portland, went to Benson, St. Mary's Academy, Portland State, Oregon State. And, I grew up in Portland, went to Trinity Lutheran. Actually, I didn't go to Humboldt, but, we would, since my grandparents lived on Gantenbein, we would go to Humboldt to play. So it was a great opportunity, to play with my cousins at Humboldt on Gantenbein. We moved away from Portland, when I was in the 5th, 6th grade. And so then I went to college in New Orleans at Xavier University, a historically Black college university. That really propelled me to, I always knew that I wanted to be a physician. So that propelled me to go to Xavier. From there, I went to Indiana University for med school, took the scholarship with the Navy. And then for general surgery training, I came back home to Portland, Oregon, up at OHSU, was on the Hill for 5 years, and then served in the Navy for 2 years in 29 Palms as a general surgeon on the largest Marine Corps base in the country that trained soldiers to practice live fire. After that, I went to The Ohio State University for CT surgery fellowship. So specializing in heart and lung surgery, pretty much anything in the chest is what we do. And so the number one killers of Americans, and especially Blacks, is heart disease and lung cancer. And so, that's really been my calling to really promote the advocacy and promote prevention. If I can prevent individuals to see me, because when I tell my patients, seeing me is like the worst day of your life, because I'm going to tell you, we're going to have to do something inside your chest, do something very invasive. So it's been a dream come true. I now practice in the Pacific Northwest in Olympia in Providence, which keeps me busy, but to that, I'm supported by my great family, married, 5 kids, strong connections to Portland. So this is a great opportunity to really get back to the community that has given so much to me.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Stephen. And share, if you will, for individuals that are listening and understand your distinguished background, how medicine, after the kid who went to Trinity Lutheran, growing up in Portland, playing on the playground of Humboldt, and I still remember that dome shape. Those are no longer available for kids today. I guess they're too dangerous, but I still remember that dome shape kind of bar assembly that they had there. But how do you go from there to deciding that you want to be a thoracic surgeon and specialize in the way that you did?
It was really the village. I fell in love with medicine being at my grandparents' house. Some of the first Blacks in Park Rose, they had an encyclopedia in which I could flip the pages and look at the different anatomy systems. I joke that I'm just an extension of my grandfathers, who were an electrical engineer and a plumber. Being a heart surgeon, we're doing plumbing on the heart. And there are certain abnormalities of the heart in which you have to fix the electrical system. An example of that was LaMarcus Aldridge, who had an electrical abnormality of his heart that got treated at at St. Vincent's in Portland, Oregon. So it was really an extension of that. My family always supported me, and they pushed me. It wasn't like they forced me to go into anything, but they really set the steps in my path. And, you know, God has been good as far as ordering my step and leading me to, you know, one step after the other. And because of, you know, just as Dr. Debbie mentioned, you will go through trials and tribulations, but being able to kind of succeed and to be able to get up from that, I've learned a lot from my past failures, which has propelled me forward. So continuing to fail forward each and every opportunity that I get.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, thank you both for those magnificent introductions. Let's dive in as we talk about diverse workforces and health and how COVID-19 has impacted Black and Brown people so significantly. The disproportionate numbers are evident, and in fact, there was an American Medical Association study that found, and they used, I think, Wisconsin as an example, where the 81% of the deaths in this example were among Blacks. And Blacks only make up a quarter of the population. And we see similar numbers throughout the country. And this question is for both of you. Maybe we'll start with Dr. Debbie. Can you share from your perspective, how and why are communities of color impacted more? What is it that you've seen in your area of practice or in the communications that you've had that would explain some of those data points? I mean, I think data tells the story, but then there's always underlying factors that play a part in that.
Okay, so I'm going to share a paradigm that I developed. As I share with people, most of my students were white. And as a woman of color trying to teach white students about power, privilege, and inequity, I was given a paradigm, and I believe it was given to me by the Lord, and it has really benefited people throughout these years. And so what it is the IST, I-S-T, of the ism, ISM, is the one that the system was designed or created to benefit. So when we think about the system of oppression in the context of race, then we're looking at the fact that people of color are not the benefactors in the context of race. So when you look at the impact of class and race, then you see where a lot of people of color do not have access to insurance or opportunities to be able to have access to quality medical. And so because of that, they're left kind of vulnerable. And so also being who we are as a people group and the evolution of our eating habits, the evolution of our options and choices, a lot of things haven't evolved far. So when it comes to soul food, everybody hasn't transitioned to, you know, smoked turkey. There are still a lot of eating habits that impact us. So the secondary factors that impact our health are really what pushed COVID over. So for example, if they have high blood pressure, and I'm sure Dr. Stephen can speak to this far better than me, but if they have high blood pressure, if they have diabetes, all of these other health conditions, then when COVID hits them with that as well, it's more likely to take them out. Add that to the systemic inequity of no medical insurance or and no funding to be able to get access to medical insurance, then you can see where our communities are more vulnerable. So I'm taking it from that aspect because my work is primarily in diversity, equity, inclusion, social justice, power, privilege, and inequity. So because of that framework, that's how I'm seeing it.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you for that. And we'll come back to that as we get to our solutions area and talk about how those what you just described, the IST and the ISM, impacts our places.
Yeah, the IST of the ISM of racism would be those who are white. They are the ones that are the benefactors in the context of race. In the context of class, anyone above poverty level would be the IST of that ISM. They are the ones that are I'm a benefactor of class. I didn't create class. When I vote, I don't vote against people who are income sensitive. In fact, I vote on their behalf. I am not biased against those who are income sensitive, and I don't perpetuate class in the context of how they can be able to have support. But because class is there, and because it's a system created to benefit those above poverty, that I'm the Istavedism. And so I have to own that privilege, and I have to recognize it in order for me to act on part of what I should do. You know, my grandmother said to me when I was a little girl, and I'm going to say this quickly, and then I'm going to turn it over to you too. But when I was a little girl, and she didn't say this nice, I just want to say that, you know, our grandmamas just they had something to say, they just said it. And she said this to me one time when I was dancing around saying what I was going to be when I grew up. She said, you need to think about why you're here on this earth. Because if you don't leave here what God has put in you to give to this world, then you're just selfish. And she said it so, ugh. And I always had that in my heart, that I'm supposed to give to those who are here. I never saw myself as someone to take. I always saw myself as someone to give. But when you are a benefactor of a system, you take without consciously taking, because the system is still in existence. So I just wanted to say that, that it's not them, because a lot of times we want to blame them, but it's really the system of class and the system of race inequities that cause a lot of this to occur.
Wow. Incredibly powerful, and the perspective is something that we all must think about, because it's easy to maybe look outside, but that internal evaluation certainly is compelling. That's a compelling argument. Dr. Stephen, same question to you regarding the communities, Black and Brown people. Why the disproportionate representation in a not so good way from your perspective?
Yeah, it's a great question. It really comes down to, this is the novel coronavirus is something that we've never seen before. Something similar was, the Spanish flu pandemic in 1918. It's been estimated that about 600,000 people died at that time. But Dr. Debbie really, hit the nail on the head, that the reason why we see what we see in the Black community is because that Blacks are 60% more likely to be diagnosed with diabetes. We're 20% more likely to have heart disease, and it's those underlying factors that COVID-19 just preys on. And if you have those chronic health conditions, you're more likely to have significant adverse outcomes with coronavirus. So in certain places in which we only make up about 30% of the population, for example, in Louisiana, but yet 70% of the COVID deaths, it really speaks to the inequities in healthcare. And Dr. Debbie, again, hit the nail on the head. Our healthcare system was a system that wasn't necessarily designed for us, and we're really starting to see that this system is a broken system, in how those that are vulnerable to this system, lack of access to healthcare, a system in which historically, Harriet Washington really describes in Medical Apartheid some of the atrocities that have taken place with the Black community. And it's those atrocities that sticks within our minds that creates that mental barrier for some of us to even seek medical attention, because of, grandma told me that if I go to the hospital, this, and this happens. You had the Tuskegee experiment. You had, a lot of these experimentation, a lot of procedures done on Blacks without anesthesia. And it's those combined factors that years after years after years, it leads to a distrust with the health system that is already broken. And therefore, when people do need to go seek a physician, they, may be reluctant. But even when they do seek health care, studies have shown that the responses to the healthcare community to Black people is different than the responses to white people. That Black people may be perceived to be more intolerant to pain than a white person, and therefore they may not get treated appropriately, or some of their symptoms may get pushed to the side. The same woman that comes in day after day complaining of chest pain, and although it's not the typical symptoms of chest pain, it leads to a misdiagnosis of heart disease, and therefore the outcomes of a heart attack are a lot worse, or that the diagnosis in the early stage of cancer isn't caught as quickly as it should be. The other issue is that a lot of the studies that are done in healthcare, unfortunately, are done as older white men as a subjects. So a lot of the medicines that we use are based upon studies that, that don't reflect our community. And because of some of our initial associations with the medical community, the Tuskegee experiment, and all the other things that I described before, it makes it harder for Black people to kind of raise their hand and say, you know what, I'll participate in that study. But those are the things that are necessary, because what we know is that in our Pacific Islanders, those individuals cannot metabolize a certain medication, Plavix, for their heart. And so if you know that, and we realize that they may need to have a different treatment. So when we talk about health equity, I don't treat all my patients equally. I treat my patient based upon what I see that they need. And if I know that this patient may have a background in which this medicine may not work, if I treat them all equally, I would just give the same medicine to everyone that sees me. But to treat them equitably is to give them the medication that they particularly need, to give them the resources that they particularly need, versus trying to give everybody the same thing just because we want everyone to be equal and on the same field.
That's amazing. When you describe that in such a detailed way, you can't help but imagine the trauma that has occurred for the people that you speak of. And while we may be looking for the equitable solutions, and I'll maybe just ask a follow-up question to both of you in this regard, we're looking for the equitable solutions. And it's great for you, Dr. Stephen, to have that awareness, to be able to speak to the population in such a way that they can feel comfortable. But we still have to address the racial trauma that comes along with what you described as well. So when we talk about trauma as it relates to equity, as it relates to Black and brown people, as it relates to healthcare and staying healthy, how do we frame that question? What does the trauma look like? How does it show up, not only in people not showing up for studies, but how does it look? How does it manifest itself in those disparities? And we'll talk about maybe even some actions that we can take. We can do that now, or we can do that later. But from that perspective, maybe Dr. Debbie, if you want to start with that from a mental health perspective, from a behavioral side, and then Dr. Noble address it from just the things that we can do and understand about that disparity that is really important for us to know.
Thank you. So when it comes to racial trauma, it's quite vast, is what I want to say. So I'm going to be using some contextual components to break it down. One of the first things I want to talk about is, and Dr. Stephen addressed this a little bit, about what's happened to Black bodies over the years. That because of, Resmaa Menakem spoke to this in his book, Grandma's Hands. And he talked about how white bodies acted upon Black bodies, and how blue bodies, which is what he calls the police, act upon Black bodies. And that when there's white body supremacy, because white supremacy, and when I say that, I'm not talking about white nationalism, I'm not talking about the KKK, I'm talking about a hegemony, a belief system, a foundational principle that's literally embedded into everything. And what has happened is that whites really believed that Black people could not feel pain. And so they acted upon the bodies. They created all of these experiments with them, with women. The what do you call them? The stirrups and things like that for us. What they've done, the instruments that they use on us were from the time of slavery. And they performed those things. How to do a hysterectomy, how to do all of these things. They did it without anesthesia. You can imagine that. And then they had a statue of the man, all proud, that he's the father of gynecology, and he had done this to the Black body. And so with taking that into consideration, what we're not understanding is the epigenesis of this, and the epigenetics of this, that what we pass on in our genes from all of that came before us. It's not going to be easy to draw people in to do, to take the risk to be reflective of their culture in medical science because of what they have done to us. And so that in itself is a trauma. So imagine the person experiencing COVID, but having that racial trauma about the medical community. In other words, I should go in, but I don't know if I should go in. And so how that impacts us. But in racial trauma, I'm going to break this down. In racial trauma, some of the things that happen to us are that we are basically disconnecting our body from our mind, and they actually go together. And the pain that we're feeling with racial trauma actually sits in our body. It actually lives there. And our bodies are trying to respond to the racial trauma that we have. Sometimes it's through rage. And Dr. Ruth King did some awesome work in that context, where she talked about how we experience rage and all of these different disguises as a part of racial trauma. So with all of this going on with COVID-19, and then the pandemic that existed before it, racism, and you have it all exploding simultaneously, that adds to the racial trauma experience of people. And so because of that, what has happened is that there's some rage, because in our communities, another thing that has happened is the myth about mental health, the lack of trust in the context of mental health. Like I said, my husband is a psychotherapist, and our families, when they discovered the fields we were going in, were like, I think they would have rather we did what Dr. Stephen did, to get a seat valid. But instead we went the mental health way. It's like, oh, you're working with people's heads. But the thing is that mental health is taboo in the African-American community still. And that a part of the racial trauma that is experienced, like I said, in that framework, is that these are some of the ways it shows up. Sometimes the rage shows up as defiance, literal defiance. Sometimes it shows up as dominance. Sometimes it shows up as dependence. Sometimes it shows up as devotion. You could be abused by someone and be totally devoted to the person, this contradiction of behavior. It can show up in depression. There's so many ways that rage looks like. And if we're not aware of what this does to our bodies, like for example, a study was done on hugging. And did you know that when we hug, we stop breathing in the United States? It's something we do. Instead of releasing a breath, we stop breathing. When you stop breathing, and Dr. Stephen can address this probably way better than me, but when you stop breathing, your organs need oxygen to be sufficient, including your brain. So if you're not breathing, or if you're feeling threatened, or if you're feeling racial trauma, you're not doing the best breathing you can do. And so you're sacrificing your organs due to some trauma experience that you're having. Also, when I was talking about epigenetically, another thing that happens during trauma is that, and help me, Dr. Stephen, if I say this wrong, but the helix, the little ladder looking thing, for some people were like, what? The DNA helix is held together by telomeres. And these things shrink based on the stress that occurs. They shrink and get smaller. Okay, so this is what happens when they shrink. You stay in a state of stress or a state of heightened trauma, then what happens is as they get smaller, they can no longer hold your helix together. As it comes and weakens and comes apart, then that makes you more susceptible to disease. And this is what we're experiencing in our community. And so if we don't talk about the racialized experiences that we have, then what happens is it builds on each other. And I gave birth to 4 children. 8'1", I'm telling you these pounds because I want, if you ever see my children, I want you to remind them about this. So 8'1", 8'13", 9'5", and 10'12 and a half. They owe me. And so I know what labor feels like. Okay, so when I give this example, I know what I'm talking about. The more relaxed I was in whenever the contraction came, the more I expanded the contraction by relaxation, then I was able to help the baby move through the canal better. So I didn't have to sit there in labor so long. So, because I knew I wanted to be through. And so the same thing for racial trauma. Each event does this to us. It contracts us. So can you imagine racial event after racial event through your childhood, through your adolescence, through your young adulthood, and you don't know what to do about that, but it's building upon building? That's what we're experiencing in our communities. And then one last thing, grief. Mm-hmm. As people of color, we're grieving differently than those who are white. Those who are white are grieving their privilege right now. They're scared to death. They're going to lose all the privilege that they have. I said I wasn't talking about the KKK or white nationalists, but they're the ones that are really authentic about the privilege. They know they have it, and they know they don't want to give it up. And those of us of color are grieving the United States we never had. They promised us a home of the brave and the land of the free, and we didn't get that. And we're still not getting it. And so we're having a shock, we're having denial, we're having times when we're literally trying to bargain. There are times when we are depressed, there are times we're angry. We're experiencing all of these things of grief. And so our bodies are under a lot of pressure right now with what's going on around us. So I just wanted to bring it.
Absolutely amazing. Absolutely amazing. I have several thoughts, but I want to hear from Dr. Noble in this. Is as Dr. Debbie was laying out the framework of how our bodies are dealing with all of this trauma, and how we get to this place of grieving, of dealing with of the trauma and the traumatic experience historically. And you said something earlier, Dr. Stephen, you talked about participating. That if we don't participate, then how can we find the solutions and the different medications and the different treatments? Because unfortunately, we live in an area where there's not a lot of diversity, and many people who look like me or Dr. Debbie don't get to go and see a Dr. Stephen. Not that I want to go and see you anytime soon, as you mentioned. That's not something that I'm aspiring to at the moment, but from that perspective, what do you say to that? What do we do? How do we become more participatory? How do we address all of the things that Dr. Debbie just talked about with trauma?
So I think first and foremost, it's we as a community, we as a society, we as a world need to acknowledge that what Dr. Debbie talked about is spot on. When you think about the DNA and you think about our maternal ancestors, so our moms, our grandmothers, our great grandmothers, the energy that we have in our body comes from them. The mitochondrial DNA that is basically the battery of every cell in our body comes from our moms. It's maternal. There's some rare situations in which it comes from paternalistic, but by and large, it comes from, our moms. So that whole notion of, he gets it from his mama or she gets it from his mama is correct. So to that point, when our mothers were sitting up there being castrated, were being operated on without anesthesia, that part was sit up there and passed on. And so then it's the stories from, grandma telling us, you go into that hospital, last person I know that went in did not come out. And so that is some of the things that are kind of linked into it. I had an example in which I had a patient that needed open heart surgery, a Black man. And, when I walked in to see him, the nurses stopped me and said, he's a very difficult patient. And, you know, it was a white nurse telling me that. And so I just looked at it as, okay, you know, he may be upset, whatever. But it's that sort of preference, that prejudice that gets put on, that this individual is a difficult patient, is an intimidating patient. And, you know, in those sort of situations, there's a code that gets called out in the hospital for those patients that can be, quote unquote, combative. I met the guys from the Bay Area. He wasn't, you know, difficult. He was just scared. And so when I sat up there and talked to him and say, hey, look, you need to have open heart surgery, he got even more upset. I was like, let me get your wife. And I talked to him. And, you know, the night before the surgery, I got called in because the patient was just irate. He wanted to leave AMA. Instead of prescribing a medication to put him to sleep, I came in, I talked to him, because at the end of the day, I just knew he was scared. The brother just needed someone to talk to and say, hey, look, you're going to be all right. I got you. We'll get through this. And lo and behold, you know, we did the open heart surgery, did the bypasses, things went fine. And he is, you know, a friend to this day because of just that empathy. So to answer the question, what is needed is more Black physicians, you know, situations in which we have more of us that are actually making those decisions of how to treat, rather than sitting up here trying to treat everyone, you know, with a medication to kind of get them to conform to what we want. So to that point, I support initiatives such as Black Men in White Coats. We have an upcoming documentary that is really looking to inspire the next generation of Black men to sit up here and join medicine, because the AMA put out a study that we have a deficit of Black men joining the career field. Right, you know, I'm currently in the process of writing a children's book to sit up here and give, to pay homage to the first Black heart surgeon in the world, the first person that did the first successful open heart surgery, who was also a barber. And so it's really those stories that need to be impacted, that really need to be told to our young people, to say, this is a field that we need to, you know, that we need to pursue. Because once we have more of us treating us, we can sit up here and have these dialogues. And it's not just about Black physicians taking care of Black patients. It's about Black physicians being at the discussion table, being in med schools to have these conversations with their white counterparts so that we can all learn from each other. One of the greatest experiences I had was serving in Afghanistan, to be able to have those face-to-face conversations with physicians that didn't look like me, that didn't have the same upbringing, in which we could sit around and basically, you know, come to agreement that at the end of the day, although we may be different in skin tone, there are some core fundamental principles that we all hold true, that it's about family, our faith, in our community. But how we sit up here and deliver that healthcare is very important. And it's that experience, is to be able to have that empathy. And for better or for worse, some of our white counterparts just don't have that background to have that empathy that is needed. That he's not, you know, he's not upset or angry. He's just scared. But the way he demonstrates being scared looks like fear to other people, or looks like anger to other people.
Dr. Noble, if I'm an employer, a large employer, mid-size even, and I'm selecting a healthcare plan, I'm trying to make a decision on how to provide the best possible care with an equity lens. Are there things that I can consider? Are there questions that I can ask? Should I be talking to if I'm a leader, should I be talking to my human resources department about how we're going to engage our population on these types of matters, so that we know that whatever population is diverse, whatever population has historically been marginalized, that I make sure that they get the right type of representation? Because what you just described was profound. The ability to go into an environment and have a diagnosis of being a difficult patient versus a diagnosis of being a patient who just happens to be afraid, that is primarily based on demographics. Are there things, conversations, solutions that you could recommend in that environment to talk to those leaders about what the things that they can do would be?
Yeah, so there's two websites, Black Doctor USA and blackdoctor.org. And those are websites that really tries to answer the question for Black people. Hey, I'm, you know, looking for a Black dermatologist, which by far is one of the, they are unicorns, Black dermatologists. And if you have a skin condition and you want to find a Black dermatologist, and this is some of the conversations that are held in dermatology, that a lot of the teaching and pictures and books don't represent Black people, you know, appropriately, that is very difficult to find those individuals. So websites have been created to kind of link people up to those individuals that reflect them and look like them. You know, when you get down to healthcare, it's really about, are those physicians in your network? And if they're not in your network and you pay, you know, then they're out of network and they're out of pocket, it's very difficult to try to find, you know, you know, just a clearinghouse or just a network of Black physicians that are within a specific sort of environment. But there are those websites that I mentioned, Black Doctor USA and blackdoctor.org, that help the everyday person try to find a physician in their area that can really hopefully be empathetic to their situation.
Excellent. And if I were having a conversation with the C-suite of executives, I'm with all of the benefits that are available, I might encourage some additional accommodations for those types of expenditures. I might make that a budgetary item to allow individuals to go further with their healthcare so that you could find those types of individuals. Let's spend a few minutes. I want to leave a few minutes for questions and answers, but I want to talk a little bit about solutions that each of you have and in how we address these types of concerns with companies, with individuals. And I know, Dr. Debbie, you have some methodology and approaches that you take to the community to offer solutions. Would you mind talking to us a little bit about the things that you do for local companies and organizations to help them be better and be the best that they can be?
Sure. So Share the Flame also works on restorative justice and healing and trauma experiences, and getting companies to rethink how they set up their environments, that the environments of which people work in sometimes contribute some of the largest amount of stress on people. So for example, color in the space or how the furniture is something that people typically look at. But one of the things that they need to look at is, how can a person of color be able to trust the environment? What are they doing to make themselves trustworthy to the people they are least like? And so that bridge building needs to come on board. How they need to negotiate with people of color in the context of how they understand them. Because this is what happens. Usually in those environments, those work environments, I think this goes along with what Dr. Noble was saying about difficult patient or not, is that those who are white employers sometimes favor the most emotionally unhealthy people of color in their racial identity. So for example, there's the racialized identity conformity is where people of color are actually looking at white people as if they do everything perfect. And so they reverence them. And those are the ones that get embraced. And we see that happening in society now with a few people. They just embrace them, but they discount the ones that can give them some real information about improvements in their establishments. So my recommendation is that they rethink the terminology that they're using. So I'm going to give you an example. So underrepresented. Mm-hmm. They need to rethink that term. I came up with two terms. It's systemically dominant, systemically non-dominant. When you use those two terms, nobody can step in there who is an ist of an ism, can step into the non-dominant role. You hear some people go, well, I'm a minority too, because I was in an environment where I was. But what needs to be recognized is, in that environment, they weren't minoritized. And they could leave that environment and be embraced somewhere else. Whereas for people of color, they can be stressed in that environment, stressed on the way home. Am I going to get stopped before I get there? I have to stop and get groceries. Am I going to be followed in the grocery store? I got out of the grocery store and now I'm on my way home again. Am I going to get stopped? I get home, what's there? So all of these places are triggers for us And we get triggered all through the day. When my son works at Facebook, and there was a bring your parents to work day, believe it or not. So we went to work with my son, and it's amazing. An amazing environment. They have a music room where you can go in and play music. It's padded so nobody can hear you. They have treadmills where they can put their computers on and work from there. They've got healthy food available. They can eat anything they want. There's no vending machine. I thought I had to pay to get it out. No, you just open the door and you're able to get healthy juice, healthy snacks. They have a nap room. You can go in and take a nap, quick nap, get up and go back to work. They have a playroom where you can just go and throw some balls around. There's a wonderful space to relieve stress while you're getting paid. I was like, y'all getting paid to play ball? All right. So these are things that companies should think about. They should think about the fact that people of color come to work stressed, and they come to work with racial trauma within them. Giving them an environment, a physical environment, that's great. But also, like I said, rethinking those terms. Marginalized. We once you bring 5 in, then they're not thinking marginalized anymore. Well, that's gone. And then there's at risk. Oof. Okay. First of all, people first. At risk shouldn't even be there. And then there's historically disadvantaged. But if you drive up in a Mercedes, they're like, nope, they're not disadvantaged anymore. So a lot of the terms we use could have pushback because of the fact that other people can join on board with those very terms. So they need to rethink how they're doing their equity decision-making, their policies, their implementation of practices and procedures. They need to think about that. And the way you can think about that is to be open to hearing all of the voices of people of color. The ones that are in dissonance, who are like not sure if you're racist against them, or you're behaving in race prejudice or race bias behavior. The place of immersion, where they realize something's wrong with this society. I can't quite name it, but there's something going on. And then immersion, where they can name it, but they don't know how to articulate it yet. But when you get the people that have internalization is different than internalized oppression. All that I named before is forms of internalized oppression, but internalization is the racial identity development stage where folks are working together with those who are doing their anti-racist work to make change in the institution. And that's when employers start pushing back. Instead of pulling in, they push back the change. And then you have those who have awareness. They have integrative awareness, where they're able to work with all the groups within the institution. So allow them to do that work. Allow them to have that opportunity to help you have growth, development, and change. Don't be afraid of change so much that you keep the status quo at the expense of the health of your employees. So that's what I would suggest.
Amazing. Absolutely. So I'm going to make one comment. We're going to continue as we're recording. So all of you who are on as participants, if you want to hear continued discussion, we'll stay just a few more minutes and you'll have access to the recording. So I wanted to make that statement. Dr. Stephen, healthcare delivery.
Yeah.
Major issue. You have some solutions in the healthcare delivery. Will you elaborate and speak to us on some of those solutions that you've found?
Yeah, I think Dr. Debbie, hit the nail on the head again as far as, really talking about some of the racial trauma. So when we sit up here and talk about healthcare delivery, we need to reimagine how we deliver that healthcare. And, the thing that it brings up and raises is the whole point that we need to get back to our roots, both, metaphorically as far as our hair roots and just our roots as a people. And what that brings up is delivering hair care within communities and areas in which we feel comfortable. And in the Black community, hair care is that place in which we feel comfortable. As a resident at OHSU, my wife is a hairstylist. I used to go to her hair salon, and I would see that, she's giving advice to her clients. And you start to realize that, her clients are seeing her more often than they are seeing their physician. The average, Black person may get their hair done, twice a month if it's a haircut, or even once a month. that's still going to be more visits with an individual than they would go in to see their physician. So then you look back that the initial sort of surgeons were barber surgeons in the Middle Ages. And because of that, the red, white, and blue of the barbershop isn't for the United States of America. It's for the fact that red was the arterial blood, blue was the venous blood, white was for the bandage that they used to wrap themselves, and the staff was for the stick. So it's really getting back to our roots as far as the barbershop. After slavery ended, the barbershop was one of the first sort of entrepreneurial sort of exploits that Black people could do. It was one of those first things in which we controlled our own environment. It was the barbershop and the church. Those communities where we controlled the environment. So when we control the environment, we feel comfortable, we feel free. If you sit up here and come to my office and you get your blood pressure taken, your blood pressure may be high for a variety of reasons. I may be in a white coat. You're worried about running late. You're worried about getting a parking spot. You're worried about, what am I going to tell you? Is he going to tell me that he's going to have to cut open my chest? If your blood pressure is a certain number, I'm going to put you on medication. You know, that's just what happens. However, if you go to a place in which you check your blood pressure, and sometimes my patients tell me I checked it at home and it's 20 points lower. Let's say you go to the barbershop, the person that you tell everything to. And if you check your blood pressure there, you may find that it's actually lower. You may find that you may not need to be on an ACE inhibitor that can cause cough and all these other medications that could have these side effects. So studies have been done to suggest that this works. The studies have taken place in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. However, we're at a point in our time in which we need to figure out how can we scale this? And that's what LiveChair has done. It was started by a young Black man out of Houston, who it was really the story of his father, who unfortunately passed away this week at the age of 56. So we're on a mission to really go out here and try to save our community. Why does everyone need to have Black health as a very important thing? Besides the fact that there is a pandemic, we have one of the highest rates of infant mortality of all industrialized countries, especially for Black women. But Black people built this country. As the health of Black people goes, so does the health of our whole economy in our society. So if the Black people in our community are not healthy, the rest of our country is not healthy. So we need to be able to support the backbone of America. And the backbone of America is Black people. We represent about 13% of the society. Your spine represents about 16% of all the bones in our body. If you don't have a backbone, you can't stand up straight. With an unhealthy backbone, with the unhealthy Black community, America cannot stand up straight. And this is why we're in this situation right now, because we cannot stand up straight. We have not treated our back well, and therefore it is really hurting us. So to that point, LiveChair is really looking at how can we get our Black community, how can we help the health and stand up straight? We have a pilot going on now, and so we're really looking to see how this can scale, and we're really looking to expand it across the country.
Excellent. How do we connect with LiveChair or with you, Dr. Noble, if we want more information on LiveChair? How do we follow you? How do we make sure that we stay connected with what you're doing?
So you can follow me at Dr. Steve MD on Twitter. I'm on LinkedIn, as well as LiveChair has their own sort of LiveChair Inc. Has a Twitter handle. And so we're really looking for 2020 to be a big year in which we have some of the data and the information to say that this is scalable, that we can do this. And it's really that connection with the healthcare community and the barbershop, trying to really address these chronic health conditions, high blood pressure, diabetes, and these are things that can happen. COVID-19 has been devastating, but with telemedicine, telehealth, we can use this in a way to really impact our communities. And my hope and prayer is that I can decrease the number of patients that come to see me for open heart surgery.
Wonderful, wonderful, thank you. Dr. Debbie, how do we follow you? And thank you. The information for Dr. Stephen is in the chat, so you can look in there if you want to follow Dr. Stephen, find more information about LiveChair. Dr. Debbie, how do we follow, stay connected with Share the Flame, and stay in connection with what you're doing?
Well, I also, another thing I was going to say is another thing that I do is come into organizations and work with their women of color. So my program is called Walk and Lead, Women of Color, and there's an H in there for healing, navigation, leadership, exploration, affirmation, and development. I take that acronym and I work with the women in each one of those representations so that they can work on being able to be successful. If they're in academia, I support them as they move through tenure. I'm not on their campus with them. I'm working with them from their home. I'm working with them in a virtual way, or I'm working with them face-to-face, we meet up. But either way, that mentorship that corporate women usually don't get, that other women, professional women, don't get as women of color, they're all alone. Being able to make sure they have someone to have that conversation with so that they can be successful where they're at. The other thing is I have a website. It's www.shareflame.com. You can find me on Facebook. I have a Facebook page, it's Debra Jenkins, PhD. I also am on LinkedIn and on Instagram, so you can find me.
Awesome, awesome. Well, you two are absolutely phenomenal, and I have a feeling that we were really just scratching the surface on the depths that we could have gone in this discussion, but I really feel that you encapsulated the things that we need to be aware of as organizations to help our people be more healthy, understanding the problem, understanding the trauma, the grieving, the different components and how we internalize those things differently, the opportunity for us to address those specifically with solutions, whether it be our barbershop connection, and I can agree with that. I try to get my hair cut more often, but hasn't been as fruitful now. But now we're opening up. So maybe that will be an opportunity to talk more about that, and I can actually get a haircut. And doctors, you guys, thank you so much for your wonderful, insightful answers, solutions, and communication. And I really hope that those who participated, to all of you, thank you for joining us. We will have this recording available soon. We'll make it available to all of those who participated, and then also to the general public as well, so they'll get an opportunity to see this. We did not get a chance to get to any specific questions from the audience, but I do think that we did a wonderful job. You two did a wonderful job of sharing what is necessary for us to move Oregon forward as a community and be better together. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Awesome. To all of you, have a wonderful rest of your day, and we will see you again soon.